Hey, it's Cressup here, and thanks so much for tuning into this interview I did with Lucas Pope, who, of course, has made such amazing games like Papers, Please and Return of the Obra Dinn. We speak about a lot of stuff, including his new game he's made, Mars After Midnight, a little bit about Obra Dinn and how before, originally, it was supposed to have some sequels and what those sequels might have looked like. We also talk about his thoughts on AI and also a little bit about what he's working on now. So lots of stuff to check out. If you do like these kind of live interviews, I often do them on my Twitch, twitch.tv/Cressup, and I play a lot of adventure games like Obra Dinn as well on there. So do check that out. And if you do like this content, please do give it a like and subscribe. It would really help me out. I do this but for a bit of fun, but if you do like this kind of content, it'd be great to get it out to as many people as possible. Without further ado, here's the interview. So Lucas, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me. I really appreciate it. I do know, obviously, especially as a solo developer, you just have endless amounts of work on. So I really do appreciate you coming on and
Yeah,
just
no
having a quick
worries.
chat. um, I guess let's start a little bit just with Mars After Midnight, of course, which you've just released for the Playdate.
hmm
For those who maybe don't know about it, or this is the first time they're hearing about it, tell us a bit more about it.
Well, it's a kind of a small game that I wanted to make during the pandemic. I felt like I was spending more time with my kids, and I felt like I would want to try to make something that my kids could enjoy, which my previous games were a little bit too heavy for their level.
Yeah, that's fair.
And yeah, yeah, it's funny. I can show them things about the games, and I can play the music for them, but either the concepts or just there's a little too much blood and death in them for them to really enjoy. So I kinda wanted to dial things back a little bit and just make something that was more lighthearted and something they could enjoy. And it has the game Mars After Midnight itself has shades of Papers, Please in it. Basically, you're set on Mars, and you're working the door at a community center after midnight, and you have the controls on the playdate has a crank on a mechanical crank, which you flip it up, and it opens a small little window where you can see another Martian outside the community center who wants to come in. And you can't let everyone in because every night the community center runs kind of a different session, which you control as well. And so you're trying to match up the session requirements, which may be only for angry Cyclops, for example, angry
Yeah.
Cyclops anger management. And so you only want to let in the Martians that have one eye and look kind of upset. And so the mechanics are very simple like that, and it's got kind of a repetitive loop where you're choosing which session to run and who to let in and things like that. But I really enjoyed working on the Playdate. It's a peculiar device,
Yeah.
black and white only with a crank for controls. So it was a lot of fun, kind of working out the best kind of game that I could for that, aimed at my kids, basically.
Did they enjoy it?
Yeah, a lot actually, and that was one problem, during development is I built this, procedural face generator where I drew each individual part so that I would draw the eyes and the nose and the mouth and, 30 of each or something like that, and the generator would stick them all together in these funny shapes, and that was 'cause I wanted this kind of surprise when you open the window to see who's there, it's a kind of another funny, bizarre alien face. And once I implemented the basic version of that, I showed it to my kids, and they were happy just opening the window and closing the window, and opening the window and closing the window, just kinda see the Martians
Oh,
themselves. And so it kinda gives you the sense like, "Okay, well, maybe I'm done," maybe the
yeah,
game is
yeah.
all good, but
Why did I bother making the rest of this game? That's it.
yeah, exactly. But, for my own satisfaction, I kinda had to go a little deeper than that. And
Yeah.
they love the game. It was one of the kind of nice outcomes for me is that they really liked the game.
Oh, how old are they both?
9 and 11,
Oh,
so
yeah.
still pretty young.
Oh, that's great. Well, I'm glad they enjoyed it. I also enjoyed it a lot, and I'm glad you did add extra elements as well because
Yeah, thanks.
I enjoyed the extra elements. But I loved on Twitter you put it as my usual repetitive. Isn't this just work BS? Um,
Yeah.
which I don't know if this is an accidental or maybe it's now slightly more intentional theme with your games because someone else in my Discord. Sean Moore pointed out as well. I was talking about how there it does seem to be this theme of kind of these horrible bureaucratic jobs that you have to do. And I don't know if that was that's in your mind now when you make games, you're kind of thinking, "Oh my, I'm making another one of these kind of games." Or obviously they're all very different in
Yeah,
gameplay
yeah,
style, but I don't know.
yeah, it's kind of the other way around. I think that's just how my brain works.
Yeah.
So whatever I create, out it pops, and it happens to be some bureaucratic, repetitive thing, basically. I even when I think about other game ideas I have, there, I'm not trying to make the same kind of
No,
game or the
no, no.
same sort of mold, but that's just how they come out. So that's my wheelhouse, I guess.
But the thing is, they, I've made it sound there like they're very similar. They're very different, but it's. I just thought it was interesting that there does see, and that you've picked up on that. Obviously, that there is
Yeah,
some
there's
kind of
there's a definite sort of core structure that I think just how my brain works thinking about narrative and interactivity and how to build something sort of leave spaces for the player's imagination and also leave spaces where I can surprise the player. Those kind of elements, for me, they slip right in when it's this kind of repetitive task that you kind of set the player up thinking they're doing one thing and then surprise them along the way and throw little loops in for them.
you're talking about, enjoying creating for the play date. What were some of the challenges? I know you said that the sort of peephole system kind of came because it was on the play date.
You just said peephole. I've been searching for a good way to describe that
Ah,
thing for 2 years, like window or door or shutter. I ended up calling it shutter in the code, but peephole is
there
an
you go.
excellent way to
I'm
put it.
happy for you to take that if you want to
Yeah,
use that.
Jesus. Uh, yeah, I think so. I had other ideas for Playdate games, and I kind of landed on this one as the one to do because the physical size of the device is pretty small, and the peephole, thank you, is a nice way to lean into that basically because you don't see when you open the peephole, you don't see the whole entire face of
Yeah,
the Martian. You kind of have to look around using a D-pad. There's a nice parallax effect too when you look around. And that's the kind of thing that worked really well in my mind with the screen, with this small black and white screen. So, for example, I wouldn't really know how to make a game where your character is a small little guy jumping around because for me it was just too hard to see the screen in that case. But here, I felt like okay, with this kind of screen, it works fits really well if you're looking through a small porthole, basically. And so that was a lot of fun, kind of working that out and putting that together. But there were other challenges too. I normally make desktop games, and
yeah.
so you have this huge canvas right in front of your face, and you have a huge keyboard full of keys and a mouse and things like that. And that sort of context switch from a huge screen to a very small physical screen was maybe one of the more difficult things for me to wrap my head around. Um, yeah, I tried to deal with it in ways like with the peephole, kind of you're looking through a window into a bigger world, but it's for me, it was very hard to capture that sense of a bigger world when the actual screen itself is so small.
And I suppose that's where the kind of storytelling elements come into play, and dialogue and or descriptions and things like that, and that's how you can build that extra
Yeah,
element a bit. And
yeah.
um, what was I going to say? Yeah, do you think you'll make other things for the play date, or was this kind of a one-off thing that you're interested in trying out?
Right now, my ideas are for going back to desktop.
Mm.
I did enjoy working on it, but I don't and I do actually have another idea for a game on Playdate. One of the ideas I had before Mars, but ended up kinda shelving because I felt like it wasn't quite right, but, that's the kinda thing I may go back to, but right now my focus is more on desktop again.
Well, let's go to desktop and the like huge successes you've had on that. Obviously, it's just over 10 years since Papers, Please. It's just over 5 years since Return of the Obra Dinn. Both amazing games. Congrats just on those two. They're fantastic. But
Thank you.
I thought it was interesting because obviously you started out a little bit in more kind of like mechanical engineering. And I think picking up on what we were talking about there about the kind of repetitiveness, I do think, I don't know if you've ever thought about this, there does seem to be an interest in your games in the design and the kind of intricate nature of it and making it really fit to what you're doing. And I don't know if there's some relationship there just with starting out in that kind of engineering background.
Probably, yeah. I don't know if it's explicit. I
No.
think it's kind of my mentality that if I'm gonna make a game for the Playdate, what is the kind of game that I feel makes sense, fits on the platform in a way that I wouldn't make this for desktop? Because if I was gonna make it for a desktop, then I should just make it for desktop. But for me, it's very I try to be very particular about kind of the environment you're gonna play it in
Yeah.
or the themes or the concepts and things like that, and keep it very focused. So I don't make big open world games. I make very focused games, and that is kind of the same mentality when you're thinking when I was back in the days thinking about mechanical engineering. You have this contraption in front of you that you need to work. So you're very kind of very focused on this one task, getting these sensors correct or getting these joints working correctly. So yeah, that same sort of thought process for sure carries over into what I do with games.
And I think it's something a lot of people, because I did ask, people on Twitter and a bit on Discord if they had sort of questions or thoughts for you. And it was something that people picked up on a lot about your kind of design process for a game. A couple of people on Twitter, Gabbro Games, Jerry Lee, Hollow Gap, they kind of wanted to know a bit more about your game design journey. I guess, do you try and build a novel mechanic first, or is it more about the story first and then how you implement that story around the design, or how do you kind of start thinking about something like that?
Yeah, it's not very structured, honestly. I,
Yeah.
I think the biggest sort of benefit I have in that sense is that I'm working alone. So on one side, it's very difficult to make a lot of resources, and I can't make huge worlds. But on the other side, I can turn on a dime for the things that I'm doing in the game. So I can start out with some ideas and take them far enough to prototype them and get them on the screen and get them in my hand and play them and realize that it's not working or realize that it is working, but not in quite the way that I thought. And so I can make big changes or small changes kind of along the way. I would say that through the whole development, I stay very frosty. There's a point when things are kind of locked down, but for me, I'm always sort of designing within constraints. So I sort of at the beginning, I set up my constraints. I have a mechanic that I think I want to work on, or a rough narrative. But then as I go further and further and put more work into it, I just keep adding more and more constraints. So I already have this level design or this mechanic design. So now I need to finish a game with that sort of thing. But even so, I will cut big stretches of work. I will change things, make drastic changes along the way if I feel like they're necessary. And that's something that, as a solo dev, is a lot more, I don't know, possible for me at least.
Yeah.
It'd be very difficult for me to cut someone else's work, but for my own work, I don't really care. I will get rid of it if I think it's in service of a better game.
On the flip side, is it difficult as a solo developer kind of knowing when to stop and knowing when something is finished and you're happy with
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's a definite
it?
problem. And that was even a problem with Mars where it wasn't it I mean, I probably could have worked on that forever, but
Yeah.
basically I was there was a very mild partnership with Panic on this. Panic is a company that makes Playdate. And I felt like I got to give them a date just because if it was only me in this bucket, then I could just, sit in here forever and enjoy the water, but because like it's a shared bucket, I feel like they got to tell them when I'm going to get out of it. So that was a kind of a new experience for me.
I was interested that when you're kind of talking about what to leave and you're happy to kind of take things out. I was interested when you were tweeting about the anniversary of Obra Dinn, and you were talking about how at one point you were thinking of maybe putting a hint system in there, which I thought could maybe completely have changed the game. I don't know what made you decide not to put that in the end.
It was kind of a synergy thing. I couldn't really figure out how to get it in there right. And Oberdin is full of a lot of sort of conflicting design elements and narrative elements too. I had a kind of running problem with that game is that there's too much magic. There's too much like the word. It's not cool stuff. There's just too much kind of extraordinary things going on. You have this amazing watch that can go back in time, and you also have these monsters attacking this boat, and you have all these characters and things like that. And there was a real problem with kind of overloading the fantasy in that game.
Right. Yeah.
And I added the book to try to clarify things, but the book is just another thing the player's got to worry about. It does simplify a lot of the sort of playing of the game, but it also, now it's a new object, a new item, a new key on the keyboard, and a new like user interface and things like that. And the hints were kind of just something like that, where I felt like the game is confusing and it really could use a hint system. So one thing would be to add a bunch of hints, and the other thing would be to simplify it in a different way that didn't add a new element that the player needed to think about or worry about. And so that's what I did instead. I basically simplified a lot of the things that required hints. I made things more obvious in the scenes, or I added a few different connections or call outs in the book itself, things like that to just try to smooth it over so that I didn't need to add a new system.
And I think that kind of works actually because there is a joy, and this is what Obra Dinn really gets sort of sent up for one of the reasons at least is that there is a joy in solving it yourself, and there is kind of a real, and I think I mentioned this to you when I interviewed you when you won the BAFTA for that game. But the joy of hearing that little sound when you get all of them right, it's just fantastic. And I don't know, obviously people do look it up on walkthroughs. I'm not suggesting that everyone just solves it on their own, but I think there is a joy in that.
Yeah, that's what I was banking on
Yeah.
basically. And I also was sort of counting on, and the same kind of thing with Papers, Please, is that I don't really make games for everybody. And I knew that I kind of had a sense that for some people will really like this game. A lot of people will bounce right off of it. And I wasn't just, I guess, tried not to worry about that too much. And I wanted to capture those people who saw, like me, who saw a list of a blank manifest in the book and just had to fill it out. Basically, it's a very kind of carnal desire just to put names in
Tick,
all
tick,
those
tick.
boxes.
Yeah.
Yeah, tick all the boxes basically. And so I relied on that kind of drive, and it put me in a spot where I thought like, okay, the person who wants to do that isn't going to want a hint that tells them exactly what to do all the time, anyways. And the game already has this kind of built-in difficulty curve where it
Mm.
sort of gets easier as you go along, just because the list of unfilled names gets shorter. So just naturally, at the beginning, there's 60 names, and every time you get three, there's three less names. So your remaining list is shorter and shorter and shorter. So the kind of whittles itself down in the end. So I felt like those kind of things work for the kind of player I'm going for, which was myself. But luckily enough, there were other people out there who felt the same way.
I mean, of course, we've got to talk a bit about Papers, Please as well. But I think some people might not realize that before Papers, Please, obviously you were making games like for game jams or smaller games. You also were at Naughty Dog for a little bit as well, weren't you? Helping in some parts on Uncharted 2. I was quite interested to know what that experience, obviously not working as a solo dev, working in a team with lots of different people, what you kind of took from that into your own work.
Yeah, I worked at Naughty Dog for 2.5 years or something. So I worked there when we shipped Uncharted 1 and Uncharted 2. That was a transformative experience for me as a game developer. Not in the idea sense, but in the production sense. They really have this concept of production down very well, and I learned a lot from all the people there. Technical things from all the programmers are very good. Artistic things, so the artists were amazing too, and designers and things like that. But the kind of process of working on a AAA game,
Mm.
and having never worked on one before, Uncharted 1 was my first AAA game, and Uncharted 2 was my last. But having, like, worked on it and basically worried about a lot of things during development, because I had made games before on my own or with other teams, so I consider myself a game developer who had come to Naughty Dog to make tools for this thing, and I did, a lot of tools, and I did some, menu code for the game itself. But basically, I had working on the game and working on the tools, and I'd been worried about a lot of things that I felt like were wrong. And it's not in my code, and not like problems with the studio or the game. It's
Yeah.
just things that I had done wrong, or mistakes I was making, or just real small stuff. But to me, it was a big deal, and I had sort of considered myself a perfectionist. But then, at a company like that, I have no control over when it ships. It's the shipping date is already set. So those kind of problems, you just kind of have to swallow them. But what I learned is that nothing I was worried about mattered at all. And kinda going through that process of working on this, big budget, highly anticipated game, being worried about a lot of stuff, and then it comes out, and then you kinda forget all the development stuff you were worried about, and you can see how players react to it, and kinda how it's accepted, and how what it means to the whole world when they play it. That's a real enlightening experience, basically. I kind of got a much better handle on what's important when you're making a game. And this is something that Naughty Dog had down really well. They
Mm.
had whole levels that were created that they felt like we don't really have time to polish this and get this up to the level that it should be. So we're going to cut this entire thing. And I'm sorry to the artists that worked on this for a year and the sound guys that already put all the sounds in it and the designers had finished most of the layouts, but it's just not going to fit in the game. So we'll cut it. And when that happens, everyone's thinking, well, okay, now the game sucks because
Mm.
that stuff was awesome and it's really important. But then the game comes out and it actually doesn't suck. It's really good, and it didn't have that stuff. So you kind of get this real nice closed loop on kind of what's important as you're making a game and what's not important, and a better sense of why you're making a game, what you're doing here. You're not just enjoying how your code looks at the end of the day. You're not, wowed with your class hierarchies and things like that. None of that stuff really matters. People don't play your source code; they play the final product. And working at Naughty Dog gave me a really what I felt was a really good understanding of that, which is something that's important for me, as a solo developer who has to kind of think in a more optimal way about development and resources and production and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, going off that as well, what was it like when Papers, Please came out? Because obviously, as you said, you've worked at Naughty Dog, you've worked on other games before, but it feels like that was possibly the first one of your own solo creation that blew up in a crazy way. And obviously, it was a bit of a cult favorite, and then it kind of got bigger and bigger. And just what was that like?
Yeah, it was wild. I mean, it was unbelievable. I got the sense that people would like it kind of early in development because I had released some betas and I had a devlog about it that got a lot of positive reaction. But still, you make a game about checking passports and you're not really thinking big, honestly. And that's one of the advantages of working solo
Mm.
and not just solo, but not even on a team of friends. I don't need to convince anybody else that a game about chat passports could be good. Um, so yeah, it was wild. It blew past all my expectations right away. The corollary to that is that when you're a small indie dev solo, especially shipping your first big title, you kinda don't want a lot of people to play it because it's full of bugs,
Right, yeah.
at the beginning. So
Yeah.
so when, 20,000 people are playing it on the first night and finding all kinds of bugs, I don't think I slept for the first 3 or 4 days
Oh
once it was
gosh.
launched. So it was kind of a blur of me fixing things as fast as I could for the first week or so.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I've just I could just imagine that. I mean, has there ever been? Have you ever thought you'd like to expand into bigger team, even like just one or two other people, or are you always quite convinced you want to just keep it as yourself?
It's hard to say always, but
Yeah.
for now, I still kind of enjoy working on my own. Like I said before, there's a lot of advantages to having everything in my head when I'm working on things. And uh, kind of, I consider myself an engineer first. And one of the things I really like to do is to solve problems, just like in general. Like if you show me a problem and some constraints, then I love to kind of work it and figure out a solution. And making games as a solo dev is this really nice structure where I already have a lot of constraints, which is
Mm.
great for
Yeah.
design and for my thought process, and, it's just very comfortable there. I'm not moving on the axis of other big studios, and if I was, I would be competing with big studios that have lots of resources. So because I can't, then I have to think about things differently. I have to design things differently and focus on different things, and to me, that just naturally creates an interesting sort of variety from other games and other developers that you can get. So it's the kind of thing where it's not just that I don't want to work with anybody because I like learning and working with other people. It's that by having those constraints and those limitations, I feel like it gives me an advantage for the kinds of games I make.
And going back to Papers, Please, Yanis on Twitter wanted to know what feedback from players about Papers, Please surprised you the most.
Well, there's two things, one good and one bad. One, well, not bad, but
Yeah.
I'll start with the very strange one I didn't really expect, but I mean, in retrospect, it makes perfect sense. Is that a lot of players went all in on the state, supporting the state, the kind of authoritarian, kind of fascist approach to it. They were very happy to deny people and play it up basically as if they were on a power trip. Which I mean, makes sense. I don't know why it surprised me so much back in the day. And then the other one was that I had more than a few people come up to me at conventions and things like that and tell me that the game captured the experience they had in Eastern Europe very well.
Oh,
Actually,
wow.
their parents had kind of experiences emigrating from countries there or moving between countries there, and they told me that the game captured that sense very well.
Which I'm guessing, I mean, I don't know how much, because obviously it's a fictional area. It's obvious the kind of things it's sort of relating to or relying on, but I don't know how much you intended that similarity or whether you kind of researched what that experience was like or you just took it from your own kind of ideas and thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's an extrapolation of kind of general
Yeah.
experiences when you go to a country where it's not your home, or you go from a country that's not your home back to your home. There's just a lot of interesting things that happen on that border there for people that I think, yeah, are basically universal.
And in terms of that one, Papers, Please, obviously that it was such a big success. After that, what made you decide to not kind of follow that up or do something extra based on that? What made you think I'm going to leave that one there and then kind of move on and start working on Obra Dinn?
Well, creatively, that's what I did, but
Mm.
on the engineering side, as soon as I shipped Papers, Please on desktops, I spent another, I don't know, half a year localizing it.
Of course, yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, there
It
was a
doesn't
lot of
just end when you ship it. I
yeah,
realize, yeah.
but but for me, that was kind of, I mean, it's not a sequel, but that was me still working on the same project in the
Mm,
same headspace, basically. And then again, when I ported it to phones, mobile phones, that was another like kind of 6 month process of going back to the project, but not really creative, more like a design of user interface design and code redesign and things like that. Not thinking about the narrative or the concepts or elements like that. So when it comes to, I guess, new games, I really don't dwell on sequels.
yeah.
I may go back to the technical side of it, but for concepts and things like that, I think there's just too much other stuff I want to do, basically. So there was never a question for me that I would do a sequel. It was always like, well, I feel like I kind of said what I wanted to with Papers, Please, and now I want to move on and try something else.
Now, this is talking about sequels. This was a big, when I asked if people had questions for you, this was the one big thing that came up. Limmy wanted to know this, Little Writer on Discord, Oscar on Twitter. Would you ever consider doing a sequel to Obra Dinn, either as a continuation or the same mechanic but a different story? And if not, how would you feel about sort of copycats or, other people taking that kind of similar mechanic and doing something themselves?
Uh, it's funny. I actually had ideas for a series of these games when I started on Obra Dinn. And that was on the assumption Obra Dinn would take like a year or something to make, which was yeah, ridiculous. So by the time I finished Obra Dinn, I was done with that.
You were
Basically, I was so
overdone.
yeah, overdone it. Yeah, I was so over the whole kind of thing that I at the time at least didn't have it in me to even think about a sequel. Um, and I don't want to say I would never do a sequel, but again, I'm thinking now about new things to do,
Yeah.
not going back to Obra Dinn. And I have no problem at all with games that reuse anything from Obra Dinn, as long as it I I think, like, I like the kind of mechanics and the design and the puzzles and the sentence building that I came up with Obra Dinn, for Obra Dinn. But I do feel like I made some mistakes, maybe things are a little too obscure or, not quite refined enough, or I worked myself into a corner in some issues. And so I'm very happy to see other games that kind of use similar or not similar, but just kind of that kind of detective, exploratory, interrogative kind of structure. I love that stuff. So no problem at all with that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess obviously what you're kind of saying is like, obviously you don't want a direct copycat, but like if it encourages people to sort of continue and develop it and
Yeah,
do extra
exactly.
stuff
Thank you. Right.
but which I think is already happening. And I don't know how you feel about this, but I would argue I find it so fascinating. For example, Case of the Golden Idol, you see these kind of games and a lot of games now, if they're in the kind of detective sphere, they'll say it's an Obra Dinn type adventure. We got
Yeah.
that quite a lot with Papers, Please.
Yeah.
Yeah. How does that feel for you?
Oh, that's great. I love it. I mean, that makes me very proud that, people feel that my games are worth that or good enough that they would, wanna spend their time making them. So, yeah, very proud.
And another question on Twitter, and this kind of goes back to what we were saying a little bit about themes around your games. Was there kind of a specific message you were trying to convey with Papers, Please? Because it does touch on the bureaucracy, but there's also like kind of morality, human rights. Was that aspect kind of put in so there could be like a little extra twist just to the kind of mechanical bureaucratic side of things?
I worked out the mechanics first,
Yeah.
and then I tried to think, "What can I do with this? What kind of story can I tell with this?" And that was basically built on lots of different encounters with different I felt like it would be interesting within the mechanics I have in this game if you have to deal with different, entrants in different ways, in these sort of interesting ways. But you know, Papers, Please is quote unquote a political game, but I didn't go into it trying to have a message
Sure.
basically.
Yeah.
Really the only thing I wanted to kind of emphasize was that border issues are very complicated. And I think like at least in the US, immigration is simplified down to the point where people just think like, "Well, I don't want anyone coming in," or "I don't," or "Let everybody in." And I just wanted to show that, like, when that's easy to say when you're far from the border and you're just watching TV or whatever, and you're getting your news through somewhere. But when it's right up in your face, there's so much more going on there, basically. And I kinda wanted to capture that. I felt like as an interactive game, this is a kind of a good opportunity to sort of show some of the complexities of the situation of border control. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and I think it definitely captures that, and I think that's why people love it because there's people think it's perhaps just one thing, and then as they look into it more and more, and then it gets more and more complicated and interesting, and I
Yeah.
think that's definitely kind of a theme in all your games. There was also quite a lot of questions from people who obviously work as solo devs themselves. There was a question from Lantern Studios. Just I suppose, do you have advice for solo devs, or how do you I guess get started in that area? It's obviously it has its advantages, especially I think in this kind of sort of forecast at the moment for the gaming industry. It sounds like there are some positives to working on your own rather than in a big company, but also there's some obviously a lot of challenges as well.
Yeah. I don't know. I do get asked for advice for solo devs a lot.
I bet, yeah.
I think, like, when it comes to me personally, I really like making games, and that's not like a broad general thing. I like the details of writing music and sound effects, and I like the details of writing code in different languages and tools, and I like designing through constraints, and I like drawing pictures and, making sprites and texturing models and things like that. So I like all those little bits, and if I wasn't putting them together into a game, I would still be doing those little bits themselves, and they'd just be, on the floor spread out in a big mess. And so when it from that perspective, it's like you couldn't stop me from making games if you tried, basically. But in the other sense of a solo developer, like I said earlier, I think has a lot of advantages that I feel like I need to lean into them in a way that differentiates my games and my work from other studios, basically. And I think the mistake you can make as a solo dev is taking the game you like that was made by a big team and trying to reproduce it with your own twist on it or something like that. I feel like the real advantage of being a solo developer is that you don't have the constraints of a huge team working on something. I mean, that sounds like a bad thing, but still, you kind of forced to do things differently,
Yeah.
and you're coming from a more personal perspective too. You can make games about things that you were personally interested in. You don't need to convince anybody else they're really good, or they will be interesting. You can make them for yourself, uh, and it just may turn out that other people like the same kind of thing. And so, yeah, for me, being a solo dev an advantage because I'm
Yeah.
already in a different headspace when I'm thinking about the kind of games I want to make. And this isn't always true, but this isn't true for everybody or universal or anything, but for me, the kind of uniqueness of a game is very important to me. The fact that a game is a particular game is unlike other games is to me very valuable. And so I'm always thinking, I don't wanna make the next big Fallout or something like that,
Yeah.
or Final Fantasy. I wanna make something that's different and unique, and that if there are people out there who want this kind of game or like this kind of game, like me, hopefully, then they have to come to me to get it. They can't get it from other studios with more resources and more marketing and more things like that. It's like the particular thing that they want, I have. I'm making that for them.
And I think you've done that very successfully because, like I said, you have other games now being like, this is a bit like Obra Dinn. So you've kind of carved out your own
Yeah.
niche, which is really cool. I mean, talking about like looking at different, obviously, you seem to enjoy experimenting and doing your own thing. Would you ever look at doing something, for example, like a VR game or something like that?
Yeah, actually, I was kind of thinking I would make a VR game after Obra Dinn. Well, I Obra Dinn is a 3D game, which was a lot of work, but I was thinking like, okay, at the time, I should make a 3D game so that I'm ready to make a VR game after that, because VR is going to be in 3D. But I learned kind of an important lesson, which is that 3D games are hard to play for a lot of people. And I don't mean old people. I mean like just in general for everybody. If you're talking about accessibility
Mm.
for and pick up and play, 2D has a huge advantage over 3D. Uh, and I had Papers, Please to compare it to Obra Dinn, and just a mouse cursor was on a flat screen is just something that's infinitely easier to think about and control and to show people and teach. And I was thinking VR would be the next big thing, but it turns out that
Yeah.
it's not.
No.
So yeah, unfortunately, I think I'm probably gonna I cooled my jets pretty hard on
Mm.
VR, and I'm not thinking about that right now.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, some big companies thought it might be the next big thing, and
Yeah.
not quite. I guess yeah. When you were sort of talking there about accessibility and Obra Dinn, were you always thinking about having that art style? Because for some people looking at that, they might have thought, oh my goodness, this is completely different to what I'm expecting from a 3D game. I mean, I love it. I think it really works with the world. But were you always set on that kind of art style for it?
Yeah, that's where I started the project
Right.
from the premise that I would take this art style and try to make a 3D first person adventure game out of it. So I spent a long time kind of sanding that rough shape down. I mean, I had started with this very artistic is not the right word, very kind of pretentious, I think, approach to, a very difficult to understand and hard to read interface, uh, effects on the screen and things like that. Just hard to tell what the hell is going on where you are. And kind of over time whittled that back to try to make it as legible as possible and try to make it um, as clear as possible to avoid the case where people play it and they think like, this game is cool, I think, and it would be a lot better if it wasn't fucking 1 bit and low res. I really wanted to avoid that kind of, 'cause you think about, why would you make a game where you need to see characters' faces and
Yeah.
recognize characters' faces? Why would you do that in 1 bit low res? It just
Yeah.
doesn't compute, and I didn't I didn't want that thought to bubble up too high in people's heads when they played it. And that to me, that was an interesting challenge. I set up this ridiculous constraint and tried to make a game with it.
But I guess there was never any point where you're like, I've got to change this. I mean, I'm glad you didn't, but was that ever a
No,
thought going through
no,
your mind?
never,
Good. I'm glad.
never.
Good.
I think there was a point when I raised the resolution slightly. So it
Mm.
was, I think, 640 by 360 for a long time, and then I raised it to shit 800 by something 640. Just because I needed just a tiny bit more legibility, but I was never going to throw the whole thing out. It was all the visual style was so core to everything I was doing
Yeah.
that that was safe at least.
And I guess when you were thinking of it as a sort of series style of thing, how would that sort of theoretically have worked? Would it have been the same kind of character, or would it have been like completely different situations but similar mechanics?
Yeah, I hadn't actually gotten that far. I'd had some ideas for settings and things like that. And actually, in the game, at the end, if you do everything correctly, if you
Yes.
solve all of the things, he walks over to the characters, if it's a guy or girl, they walk over to the bookshelf and they put the book away.
Yeah.
And in the bookshelf, if you've done it if you solved it properly, then there's a kind of s stack of items there that, are supposed to reflect the adventures that the character goes on after the Obra Dinn.
Okay. Right.
And there are some things there that give you clues about kind of the settings or the environments that I was thinking about. But in general, it would have been, the idea was the same kind of thing. You have this watch, this pocket watch, and you can go back and see the moment of death, and you need to solve mysteries, basically, just like with the Obra Dinn.
Well, we'll never say never with that one because
Yeah.
it's got a lot of people who love it. But I appreciate, obviously, you're looking at other things at the moment. I mean, on that point, actually, I wonder how you feel about AI and using that in gaming and whether it can be used. There's an interesting way of using it within games because there's a detective game I saw recently at a games conference called Dead Meat, which was a detective game, but it was a human written character backstory, but then it used AI to take off that, and you could kind of interview a suspect, and they would respond with whatever you typed in, basically whatever phrases. And I'm just wondering if you've ever
Did you
thought of
did you
using.
play it?
I did, yeah, and it was interesting. Obviously, it was still it's very early concept. I could show you the link of that. Actually, it was really interesting. But I've just wondered if you've ever thought of you know, dabbling with that or how it could be used or had any kind of thoughts around that?
Uh, I for me, AI is basically terrifying,
Yes,
and I think about kind of the uses for AI, or at least the ways that I would use it, and it feels to me like it would be doing the things that I would enjoy anyways. So,
that's
for
fair.
example, to have it create art for a game. Well, I like to draw, so I mean, if it does that, then it's taking away something that I enjoy doing. So I wouldn't use it for that. And it's kind of the same thing as you go down the list of the things I do. Like I said, I like to make the music. I like to write code. I like to solve design issues. All those things. I don't know. I'm not struggling for answers there. I like finding the answers myself. I like working on that stuff myself. So in that sense, I don't think I would ever use AI for that sort of thing. Um, and just the kind of I don't know the concept of AI. It's a text completion sort of technology of taking things that other people had created and then remixing them and then using them in a way. Yeah, I don't know. It just doesn't sit quite right with me. So I feel fortunate that I was able to find success before the dawn of AI,
Yeah.
and I'm gonna just keep doing things the way I've done probably until I'm dead, which is just kind of crafting it myself and maybe doing a poor job of it, but still enjoying the ride.
Well, speaking of which, obviously, I'm sure you're still working on things with Mars After Midnight, but you kind of mentioned that you're sort of looking ahead to back to desktop stuff. What have you got in mind? What are you thinking of?
Okay, okay, come on. But I will say, okay, what I can say about
I had
that a
to
little bit.
ask. Come on, I had to.
One of the things I really liked about Obra Dinn was that I set it on this boat, this sailing ship I knew nothing about sailing ships, these tall ships from the time. I knew what everyone else does, which is, pirates were on
Mm,
these things, but actually there's no pirates in the game, and I intentionally did not want to reproduce the kind of popular media vision or version of these ships. And so I did a lot of research, which means I basically bought and borrowed a lot of books on
right.
these
Yeah.
ships. And to me, that was a lot of fun. That was really fun reading about this stuff, and kind of going over it and putting together my take on what I was reading and finding the little interesting bits of stories from back in the time and being influenced by that for the narrative and things like that. And so for the game that I'm thinking about now, I've really tried to find something like that. Like, what's a subject I don't know much about
Mm,
and that is maybe represented in popular media, but is only really represented kind of in a derivative way. So, this thing shows it and then something else shows it, but it's kind of half taken from the first thing, and then the next thing is half taken again from that thing. And so they're all kind of very derivative and similar. And when people see that stuff, they kind of see what they expect because it's, what's being shown. But I get the sense that there's more there, that if you go back to the original sources, you go back to the books that were written at the time, or you go back to the books about these subjects, then there's a lot more interesting things that bubble up. Basically, just hoping for the same kind of experiences as I had on Obra Dinn. So I'm doing a lot of research on with books and things like that for my next project.
Okay, so we need to find out what library Lucas Pope is taking
Yeah,
books out of
right.
and discover it from that. I mean, do you get much time to play games yourself? Is there any like recently you've been playing that you've enjoyed?
A little bit. Yeah, after I shipped Mars, I got a little bit of time to play. I played through Tunic
Oh
recently,
yeah,
which was
yeah,
one was on my list for a long time. I love that. And but mostly I when I have time to play games, I try to play something with my kids.
yeah.
So on the Switch, we'll play a Mario game or something like that.
Yeah, I mean those are great games to
Yeah.
play, just like with other people as well. Do you feel pressure now after Papers, Please and Obra Dinn for whatever you're working on? Now that you people kind of know you by name, is there pressure in that, or is it not really? You're just kind of doing you. I feel like I know the answer to this, but is it you're kind of just doing your
Yeah,
own
come
thing?
on.
Yeah,
There's tons of pressure, and that I mean that was one of the reasons that Obra Dinn took so long. Is that
yeah.
there was a lot of expectations for me and my follow up from Papers Please,
Mm,
and then Obra Dinn did pretty well, so that kind of let out a little bit of the pressure,
yeah,
basically. And for for Mars, I tried to think like I'm not really making. I don't, it sounds weird, but I really want to make this game for my kids. If my kids like it, then I feel satisfied, basically. And so my kind of it was easier to reach that sort of satisfaction level for me personally, and so that also helped to kind of reduce the sort of pressure that I'm under. And the industry moves on. Like
yeah.
the games people play move on. I feel very fortunate for my success with Papers, Please and Obra Dinn. But there's no guarantee that I can make another game like that. And I think like if I die now, that's enough. 2 good games. There's not. I don't know. I feel like, and this is personal for me.
Mm.
Internally, I feel like well, I can be okay with that legacy basically. So that helps too. Just in the day to day things, I can sort of think about more like, well, what do I want to learn a new programming language? Maybe now is the time to try to explore some new learning things I could do, and not worry so much about what people are going to think about my next game.
I mean, Sergey on Twitter had quite an interesting point, kind of more personal thing. Just how are you enjoying living in Japan, and how long is it you've been there now?
It's been a while. I think it's over 10 years.
Yeah,
I really like it because, and this was true when I moved here, and it's, it's still true now. That for me, it's very isolating.
mm,
I like the fact that I don't speak Japanese that well, actually. So I kind of I live in a bubble with my family, and I find that I don't know comforting when it comes to work. Basically, it allows me
yeah.
to focus on work, and that can be bad, too much work. But like I said, it's only work in the sense that I can do something actual financially productive with it. But I like to draw, I like to program, I like to do all this other stuff that I can do by myself in a room somewhere. So it kind of doesn't matter where I live, but it's the places you could live and be comfortable in that situation. Japan's pretty high on the list. So yeah, I'm happy here.
And it's a pretty cool place. So I'd love to go back there again. But yeah, very jealous. A final question. This is just a random question I normally throw in on these things. Do you have a favorite chocolate bar, Lucas?
Favorite chocolate bar? Yeah, it's a tough one. Well, I like chocolate. I don't know many
That's fine.
people who don't like
Also,
chocolate.
sometimes we've had answers where people are like, I don't really eat it. So that's fine as well if you don't. But yeah, if you do, that's great.
Yeah, I like chocolate. I mean, just a regular Hershey's bar. I don't
Yeah.
ask for much, honestly. Yeah, and I don't have any taste buds to speak of, really.
Oh.
So Hershey's bars is enough for me.
um, is there anything else you'd like to mention or you'd like to point out to people? Or, I mean, obviously, I'll share. People are aware of your work, I feel, but I'll share all the links and things like that. Is there anything else you want to mention?
No, thank you for the questions to everybody, and thank you to you. I mean, we've been talking for a pretty long time now. I think, right since Obra Dinn, we talked
Yes.
at Baptist. So yeah, I'm glad that we're still talking. You got in touch with me, and I'm happy to
Yeah.
do this.
Well, I appreciate it because I know you are very busy and, I totally get that. So I really appreciate it and just really, really looking forward to what you make next.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Laura.
Thank you.